So can you all see the presentation?
Yes, it looks good.
Good. What has been invited to talk about is kind of partly about hydrogen. So the title, Development and Growth of a Hydrogen Energy Sector, is something that I chose personally. And the reason why is because I think looking at hydrogen from an energy sector perspective is quite important in order to understand what is currently going on and developing in the society. So let me see now if I can. Here. This is kind of the standard information you get when you look up hydrogen at Wikipedia, for instance. Normally, we talk about hydrogen as H2, which is the gas molecule of hydrogen. Typically, hydrogen is a light molecule. It's colorless, odorless, tasteless, non-toxic, and it's very highly combustible, which poses a lot of challenges to society. Typically, industrial production of hydrogen is mainly from steam reforming of natural gas. About 96% of all the hydrogen that is being produced in the world today comes from steam reforming of fossil fuels. A small percentage is produced by more energy intensive methods and typically by electrolysis of water, which leaves no carbon footprint if we use renewable energy as the source of energy. And then we also have other ways by methane pyrolysis, which is kind of a one-step process that also produces solid carbon in addition to hydrogen. Today, most of the hydrogen is used near the site of where it's produced. And the two largest applicants of hydrogen is fossil fuel processing, and that means hydrocracking, and also ammonia production, which is mostly for the fertilizer market. In hydrocracking, the hydrocarbon molecules of petroleum are broken into simpler molecules by the addition of hydrogen. And this is done under high pressure and also in the presence of a catalyst. Typically, the major products from hydrocracking would be jet fuel and diesel. Ammonia, most ammonia is produced on a large scale by the Haber-Bosch process, where you allow nitrogen and hydrogen gases to react at high pressures, typically 200 bars. If we look at hydrogen deployment or application of hydrogen in society, in addition to the industry, hydrocracking and fertilizer market that I just talked about, there are many new markets that are emerging, and which would be typically the big transportation market. It would be industry energy, replacing fossil energy in industry processes. It could be for heating and power, also for industry feedstock and power generation. And these different sectors we are really dependent on them if we're going to develop a hydrogen energy sector, because we cannot use that by scaling up the current offtake of hydrogen as is. So looking at the transportation sector, some of these smaller forklifts and cars are already using hydrogen, but for larger vehicles and for ships and aviation, there's still some way to go. And same or likewise for other sectors. There are some grand challenges that exist if you think about developing a hydrogen energy sector. And they are listed on the screen here. I won't go through them because I will get back to them one by one in the following. So starting with number one, how can we produce hydrogen and ammonia with a minimum of energy loss and at lower cost? Typically, hydrogen by natural gas steam methane reforming has energy efficiency of 70 to 80% by water electrolysis. We are typically less than 70%. And if we're going to produce ammonia by the Haber-Bosch, we talk about plus minus 50%, depending on which source we use. By green hydrogen, typically the efficiency would be less than 50%, and by blue hydrogen, it could be slightly above. So industrial ammonia production, for instance, is a very heavy emitter of CO2. And it's probably one of the worst sort of chemical reactions, industrial reactions that we have today. So a lot of scientists has argued that in order to overcome this problem and make, for instance, ammonia production more sustainable, we need to change the game entirely. And there are new methods like electrochemistry, electrocatalysis, photocatalysis, and photoelectrocatalysis, many new processes that are kind of one-step processes, for instance, for ammonia production by lower pressure and temperature, and without having to go through the step of producing hydrogen. That could really change this game, but they are currently at low TRL. So in the short term, if you are going to build a hydrogen energy sector, they won't help you. But in the long term, it's very, very important that we go this route and also focuses our research effort on these more long-term, future promising and novel processes. Second challenge is really how can we create a safe and resilient transport and distribution system for hydrogen-based fuels. And we know that the different forms of hydrogen, pressurized or liquid hydrogen, they have very, very different characteristics and requirements in transport and storage. Compressed hydrogen, we are talking about 200 to 500 bars. Liquid hydrogen, cryogenic hydrogen is cooled to minus 253. Ammonia is a very poisonous product. And if you are going to supply this into the transportation market and also transported by cars or tank vehicles on the roads and in tunnels, this poses a large hazard potential and a large technical risk for the different energy carriers. So designing more flexible and safe transport distribution solutions is really necessary. But those two are not necessarily they're kind of pointing in opposite direction, because if you need flexibility, this is difficult to achieve with energy carriers that has such large characteristics as we are talking about here. The market potential for hydrogen in different transportation segments is about how can we develop end-user applications for hydrogen-based energy carriers. And this needs to be done on a large scale. So if we are going to introduce a hydrogen economy and hydrogen sector, and including the transportation sector, we need to find ways to scale this up quickly. Currently, hydrogen platforms are used for all kinds of land transport, but also commercial available solutions are suitable for the maritime sector, but we don't have good answers to the more, how do you call it, the long sea shipping sector, because the characteristics of hydrogen makes it a little problematic of how you're going to carry this on board if you are going to be on the sea for weeks and months. So unlocking the hydrogen economy is about how can we stimulate investments and build a system with acceptable risk for all stakeholders. The oil and gas or petroleum sector is kind of a socio-technical mature system. And that means that for the petroleum sector, we can have an accident, you can have a bankruptcy of a company, a lot of things can happen, but it still wouldn't be a threat to the petroleum the petroleum sector as such. For hydrogen, this is very, very different. It's a very immature socio-technical system, and it doesn't take a lot of flaws and failures before the system as a whole could be threatened. For instance, if there is a massive explosion or fatal accident, it could really threaten the system, and also a large investment failure, for instance, could be a similar threat. We talk about hydrogen as an energy carrier, and it's obvious that hydrogen, if you're going to have a success, it requires complementary investments along the entire value chain. And this is also part of the problem, that we have a system that requires simultaneous actions by a number of stakeholders along the value chain and with opposite interest. For instance, if you were a hydrogen producer, normally you wouldn't decide on an investment decisions before you know that you have an end customer and a transportation system that can bring the hydrogen from your production site to the end user. As an end user, you will not invest in anything on the end use side before you know that the transportation and product delivery is in place. And normally, if you are going to follow common market rules, these things tend to develop sequentially and bit by bit. If we're going to introduce a hydrogen sector within 2030, which is really necessary if we're going to be able to contribute from the hydrogen sector to the Norwegian emission targets and the European emission targets, then this needs to happen not sequentially, but more or less simultaneously. And this poses a big challenge to how do you regulate, how do you introduce, develop incentives, and how do you stimulate this to happen, so that all the stakeholders are able to carry and balance the risk that are involved. And then I talked about this socio-technical system. How do you actually build trust in a hydrogen economy in a very short time? Well, there are some core values that relates to public acceptance and participation. We have to have a belief that those who are affected by the decision also feel that they have a right to be involved in the decision-making process. We need to make sure that we include public's contributions in the process in such a way that they will influence the decision. And we also have to promote sustainable decisions by recognizing and communicating the needs and interests of all participants. Furthermore, we have to seek out and facilitate involvement of those people or groups that are potentially affected by such decisions. And we have to seek input from participants also in designing how they are actually participating. And we need to make sure that the information that are provided by the participants are being used in a meaningful way. And finally, participants need to be shown how their input really affects the decision. So this is from a societal perspective, really a challenge because you have to guide this process and you have to really try to accelerate such a maturing of the socio-technical system. Then finally, I thought what I would do was to just point at what is being done on the international level in order to secure growth of a hydrogen energy sector. EU is really going or leading the way in many ways. And they developed in 2020 what they call a hydrogen strategy for a climate neutral Europe. And they have also established the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, which is supposed to be a facilitator for stimulating the rollout of production and use of hydrogen and build a pipeline of projects. This was done also in 2020. And then in 2021, the EU came out with a COVID recovery plan that also points to hydrogen as one of the solutions for Europe to recover from the COVID. So typically then, what the EU is planning to do is, number one, they will point at ways to boost demand for and scale up of production. They will look at different things like sustainable and smart mobility strategies. They will explore additional support measures and demand-side politics for the end-use sectors. They will develop and introduce comprehensive terminology and European-wide criteria for certification. And they will also look at something which a lot of economists has pointed and businesses has pointed at for a long time. Develop a scheme for a carbon contracts for difference program, meaning that if you do something involving hydrogen, you can get reimbursed for the difference between the cost of that relative to something that is available in the commercial market. The next point on the EU agenda is designing and enabling a supportive framework, support schemes, market rules, and infrastructure. And this is also what we were talking about a minute ago. You need to make sure how regulations, support scheme, economic incentives work together in order for this to happen. And finally, the EU points to the need for promoting research and innovation in hydrogen technologies. What they have done is that as part of the Horizon 2020, this was in Q3, I think, for 2020, they call for a 100 megawatt electrolyzer and a green airports and ports call. They have now established what is called the Green Hydrogen Partnership, which is focusing on renewable energy production, storage, transport, and distribution. And they prioritized end uses of clean hydrogen at competitive prices. EU also want to key pilot projects that support hydrogen value chain, and this is coordinated with their set plan, and this is from 2020 onwards. And finally, they also point to the new ETS innovation fund. The first call in that was launched in July 2020. So there's a lot of new financial structures, instruments that are being launched to help spur investments and research in hydrogen in the years to come. And in Norway, we just recently we had a call for a new research center on environmental friendly energy research with focus on hydrogen. The March of this year, we had grants for 2 new centers, where one center is a center placed here in Bergen, where NORCE and UIB and HVL and Handelshøyskolen are partners, along with the University of Stavanger and also Fridtjof Nansen Institute and the Transport Economic Institute in Oslo. And there was a second FME awarded in Trondheim. So together, these 2 FMEs are not competing very much. They are very complementary in the way that they are set up. So that means that for the next 8 years, the government will put 40 million kroner annually into these 2 centers for research, both on the short, medium, and long term, and covering technical, social, legal, economic fields of sciences, and also the whole value chain from production to transport to application of hydrogen energy carriers. So I think then I spent my 20 minutes. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.